Welcome to the first webinar of our FutureBets web series. To all of you who attended our FutureBets unconference last year, thank you for the appreciation and the accolades. We were well covered by CNBC, Economic Times, and the Mint as well, which wrote a piece on our stock market of the future simulation. Though we were sad to cancel our event this year in the wake of COVID-19, we're very excited to take it online, where you can listen in to some of the brightest minds from all over the world from the comfort of your couch. And I'm glad that it is reaching people in various parts of this world. Check out makefuturebets.com for upcoming webinars, as we are adding to this web series every day. Before we start, I would quickly like to introduce our group to you. Ashika Group is a 25-year-old diversified financial services group offering services such as investment banking, lending, wealth management, and asset management. Our team of over 300 work together to provide services to over 125,000 retail clients, 100 plus institutional clients, and 100 plus family offices. And I, Ishita Jain, will be your moderator for the evening. I'm part of the Institutional Equities team at Ashika Stock Broking, where we write proprietary research for unique stock ideas and service some of the top public market funds of the country. I hold a master's in biotech enterprise from Johns Hopkins and a biochemistry degree. Before this, I had a brief stint at a healthcare-focused investment bank on Wall Street. For our first webinar of our FutureBets web series, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Keyu Jin. Dr. Jin is a tenured professor of economics at the London School of Economics. Her field of expertise is international macroeconomics and the Chinese economy. Her research has focused on global imbalances and global asset prices, as well as on what drives China's growth model, the Chinese saving puzzle, and the ramifications of the one-child policy. Her academic articles are published in leading journals such as the American Economic Review. She has consulted for the World Bank, the IMF, the New York Fed, Bank of England, along with many other financial institutions. She holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD from the very prestigious Harvard University. Dr. Jin is joining us live from Beijing. Dr. Jin, on behalf of the team at the Ashika Group and all our attendees, I want to welcome you again and thank you for giving us your time. The format would be, Dr. Jin, you would speak for about 20 minutes or so, and that will be followed by a Q&A session with pre-submitted questions moderated by me. Thank you all for sending in questions. I will try my best to accommodate them all. We were very overwhelmed by the response we got, and we currently have over 250 participants on this call right now. Ladies and gentlemen, over to you, Dr. Jin.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Dr. Jin, I don't think we can hear you.
Okay, let's see. Is this okay? No?
Okay, you're on. Great. Thank you.
I'm good?
Yes, perfect. Go on.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I am joining you live from Beijing, where I have just completed my mandatory quarantine of 14 days as of yesterday. Of course, I have a new imposed lockdown coming from my parents, who still do not believe it's safe to be out and about, even though in Beijing, there is no more new cases. All of the new cases are from imported from abroad, from our students overseas, and it does not exceed a dozen a day. But still, Beijing has, and the rest of the country has fundamentally changed in social behavior, in the way that we work, in the way that people are behaving with respect to each other. So I think that this is the reason why we're seeing the coronavirus episode being fairly well contained inside China, and this is not just some data manipulation or information hiding. This is real. I can say from my own experience that I don't know of any one of my friends who know of other people in Beijing who have tested positive. Outside of China, I have plenty of my own friends tested positive. So this is the extent of the difference between what's going on in China at this moment and what is going on in the rest of the world. Let me make a couple of points about economics in general, the economy in general in the world, and then turn back to discussing the comparative different approaches between China and the rest of the world. The first point is this is probably going to be the biggest economic event of our lifetime. So for those of you who are still hoping for a very rapid V-shaped recovery for the global economy, who think that this is just going to be a temporary economic episode, I think we really need to think again. As the data has shown, we are already hitting the size of the Great Depression of the 1920s, even greater than the recession, the US Great Recession of 2008. So it is economic depression that we are potentially facing, not an economic recession. And I think this has to be a message that has to be clear for all of us who are in economies that are integrated with the rest of the world, or who at least depend on the economy in the rest of the world. So we're all in this together. If we look at the numbers, it is really quite impressive. The US stock market has fallen from the peak of this year to the trough of this quarter by 35%. Credit markets have already seized up. Credit spreads on junk bonds have become from 300 basis point above Treasury bills to more than 1,000 points above Treasury in a matter of 2 weeks. In the last 2 weeks, the unemployment benefits that have been claimed by Americans became from 200,000 people to 6.5 million people this week. During the great financial crisis of 2008, we only saw about 8 million jobs lost in the whole total of a few years. But right now we're seeing millions being lost every month and maybe even weeks. So if we look at the projections of the economic growth in the US, major financial institutions and government institutions are revising downward their projections, economic growth projections, by the day as new data comes in. Now the main projections are about 25 to 35%, even 50% drop in GDP this quarter, second quarter in the US. This is really, really, really very large. It's already exceeded what we've seen in 2008, and the size and the plunge and the depth of this economic downturn has matched that of the Great Depression of the 1920s. But do you know what's different between the 1920s and now? The difference is that between the time that the 1929 depression was triggered to the actual economic downturn of all these numbers that I've cited, it took about 3 years. This time in the US, it took 3 weeks. So we are already seeing a major economic calamity, mostly because it's just about shutting down the economy completely. It's a free fall. It's not even gradual. Things that take place over time, where there's an adjustment, everything's just shut. If you think about the US economy, where 80% of GDP is coming from services, and I imagine that in India it's also a very high number. It's a little bit different in China because our economic structure is not so highly tilted towards services. Even if you imagine that half of the services are shut down, and there will be definitely more than half the services that shut down, that's 40% of GDP. So we're talking about mega economic downturns, not a small recession here. The main question I think that remains for the global economy is really how long this will last. And this will really be what separates this from a Great Depression of the 1930s. The Great Depression of the 1930s had an L-shaped kind of economic pattern where it was a free fall, and then a complete stagnation for 10 years. Hopefully we will not repeat that L-shaped. Right now it's more like an I-shaped, and we don't know where we're going, but hopefully it will not last that long. But there are 3 major risks to consider at this point, and I don't know whether in India you are thinking about the same kind of risks that are posed on the global economy as we are. I have to say that the Chinese people are not quite braced for reality either. I've been writing a few pretty stark articles recently that has caught a lot of attention of the Chinese people. They were very surprised as to why and how things are so bad in the global economy, because they don't really have a clue by just looking at their recovery in China, which was a steep plunge, but a relatively a gradual but a solid recovery at this point. So the three major risks is, first of all, we don't really know whether these mitigation policies that are pursued by the Western economies really work and work fast enough. Right now, the US is pursuing mitigation, or really half mitigation policies. I mean, until yesterday, people in Florida were still going to the beach, and they have a majority of population that's above 65 years old. I don't really know whether this is really serious mitigation or not. The optimistic case will be more like Japan and Korea. But in Japan and Korea, they did a lot of testing. So you would need a lot of testing, a lot of self-discipline, very stringent self-isolation measures for a period of time to flatten the curve in an effective way. We don't know whether that's going to work in the US as of now. The numbers are still climbing, and we're not really at the peak of the episode of the pandemic for the US. So whether mitigation works will be a very major factor. A second associated risk is, are we going to be hit with a second wave of infections? This is a real question and real concern in China, because China has been a little bit ahead of the curve, in the sense that China had the most serious problems in January and February, and now things are returning slowly back to normal. It will be very interesting to see whether the resumption of business, and it's not even operating at full capacity, everything's operating at half capacity. Side note, I just went on the first day of my freedom to the mall, which was open, and it was completely empty, even though there are no new cases inside Beijing. So that tells you the extent of how rapidly we can see demand coming back to life. So a second wave is possible with a resumption of business. We'll see whether it is the case with China, whether it's the case with Japan and Korea. But also we have to know that there could be a seriously more virulent second wave hitting the population by autumn. So even if things are get under control by the summertime, we don't know whether we're going to have a repeat in the autumn. And this is going to be a very fascinating question, because different countries pursue different strategies. China went all the way to containment, pretty successful so far, but it's really about suppressing the virus and monitoring every single individual that has symptoms, every single one of them. Not many countries can do that. However, that means that there's no herd immunity. That means that the second wave of the infection could be even more severe. If the virus mutates, which apparently I've learned that coronaviruses are easy to mutate, that can hit the population with even greater aggression and stronger force the second time around. And this is a worldwide phenomenon, not just parts of the region. So this is the first risk is really about the virus determining the timeline and the severity, not us, right? It's not up to us. And until we have a vaccine, which will take 18 months, I'm not really sure what strategy different countries are pursuing will work. Maybe Japan and Korea will eventually build herd immunity as they try to slow down the spread of the virus, but still not completely suppress it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Both strategies are highly risky. Nobody knows which one is the better one. The second kind of risk is, will these policies work, right? I think a lot of you have already heard of the central banks and the governments of European and American officials pulling out whatever they have. Really, it's all about infinite liquidity, infinite kind of aid, and unlimited everything, basically. Doing whatever it takes is what the governments have been saying. Yes, that's great. That is exactly what is needed, but that requires three kind of policies to work conjunctionally together. Health policy, fiscal policy, and monetary policy with equal and efficient, force. However, it's, you know, this is good news in some ways, right? This is how the stock market has interpreted it, good news. But there's another aspect of these policies that is a signal to us, which is that things are going to get really, really bad. And the government knows it, which is why they're pulling out everything they have. This is called the signaling effect of monetary policy. We've seen it many times before. Vast amount of unconventional loosening of monetary fiscal policies is a signal that things are about to get really, really bad. Not that they should be interpreted as a good thing, but of course, in the absence of these policies, we would be in a much worse position. So you need these three policies to work together. How effective they are in question. I think monetary policy in the West is of course, you know, the unconventional policies took 3 years to implement, and the last time the world economy hit a crisis, this time it took 3 weeks, which is all very good news. But interest rates are already at the zero lower bound, right? So already near zero. So reducing interest rate is not going to do a lot to stimulate the economy. Monetary policy is not going to bring back jobs because it is not them. It's not liquidity issues or solvency issues or financial market issues that is causing any kind of credit freeze or causing a business to have to lay off the workers. It is the virus that's causing that. So how does monetary policy take care of something that's caused by the virus? It won't bring back jobs because jobs shouldn't go back to normal anyway. So there's very limited effect of monetary policy. Now, of course, fiscal policy is very important, and if targeted right, they will definitely help pretty much everybody in the economy. But this time around, it's not just about bailing financial institutions and banks. This is about bailing out the people, bailing out businesses, small and large, and bailing out financial institutions at the same time. It's like an asteroid that directly hits the world, and you have to bail out everybody. So this is a massive project, and we will see how successful it is going to be. Lastly, I do think that we need to think about what happens in the immediate future, even after things go back to normal, which, you know, again, we don't know when. There is a risk of inflation in the Western world, in the industrialized world, even though I personally believe that we won't see inflation as a major kind of problem for the world economy because we have a persistent lack of aggregate demand. But on the other hand, there is going to be a serious supply shock, right? So there's going to be limited supply, and that can trigger rapid inflation. So we could end up in a situation of stagflation as in the 1970s, even if the economy starts to gradually go back to normal. But we also know that demand is not going to go back to normal that quickly. Supply chains are not going to go back to normal very quickly. Often after crises, businesses change the way they operate. They adopt new technologies. They go digital, which means that they're not going to hire back the workers that they have fired. It's often these during crisis time that they cleanse their operations and their system, and lost jobs don't find their way back. So we could see persistently high unemployment rate, which poses a series of other kind of problems. Will demand go back to normal as quickly? You used to go to the restaurant 3 times a week, and you used to go to the movie theater once a week. Are you going to make up for lost time by going there by doing a double time? 6 times a week at restaurants, 2 times in movie theaters? No, I don't think that's how people are going to behave. Are you going to start buying houses and cars with greater enthusiasm, or picking it right back as before you left it off? I don't think that's going to happen. So this is permanently lost output. And again, services constitute such a big part of GDP in these parts of the world that it will have a permanent dent to the economy. So that's the world outlook. Maybe I can take 3 minutes to describe what's going on in China and how these things can contrast. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. You can.
Okay, good. Just checking. So in China, things are going back to normal gradually, but again, at half capacity. So in some ways, the world is lucky that we have a kind of an unsynchronized global downturn and recovery in different parts of the world. So China gets through this virus first, at least for now. Apparently about 2/3 of supply chains and normal businesses and manufacturings are already back to normal. From my own personal experience, people are really working half as much as before, or half as present in the workforce as before. Most offices have half the people, half the employees in one place at the same time. I just made a dinner reservation with my parents yesterday, or for tomorrow. They said that for 3 people, you need to sit in 2 separate tables, on 2 separate tables, because they do not allow for groups of 2 or more at a time. So things are going back to normal, but they're really not. And people have fundamentally changed their behavior. I have not met one single individual on the streets or in the parks that don't wear a mask. I was turned away from the park because I forgot my mask today. I'm still needing to get back to normal and getting into habit. Even the most coveted, kind of most, to me, inelastic demand for women are so, facial parlors where you would have 40 people at a time any single day doing that for any single individual parlor. They're allowing 2 people in a day, and people are staying home. They're not even doing that because they're so afraid. That's the point I want to make about China, is that because of the SARS experience, maybe because of some kind of schizophrenic obsession with hygiene and health, people are fundamentally scared of this thing, even though there are no new domestic cases, even though things are really under control as perceived by the people. They are fundamentally afraid, so afraid that things are not going to be back to normal for a very long time. So I think in terms of the economy, what China experienced was a severe economic plunge because everything stopped for 2 months, and now things are going back to normal gradually. So there will be serious loss, but still that could be less severe than the American approach, which is a severe plunge, but it will take a few months of self-isolation strategies, because the mitigation strategies are not as draconian as the one that we have put in place in China, that they will have a more protracted economic downturn. In China, I'm not sure how it's working in India. Monitoring surveillance is extremely at a high degree and very effective. I think at the height of this, even buying groceries, people were allowed once every 3 days in a very organized fashion to go downstairs. When I came back from London just over 2 weeks ago, I was put into mandatory quarantine, and there were 8 people monitoring me. I had to report my temperature twice a day to the community. These communities are basically all part of the communist organization that extends into the compounds, residential compounds. And I had to report it once on an app, so people know, the government knows where I am and knows what I'm doing. And I would be breaking the law if I exit my apartment, which of course I didn't dare to do. Everything is highly organized and everything is very tight. So that's a very big difference. I mean, I came from London, and even as of mid-March, nothing had changed. It's as if people just thought this was some remote thing that couldn't affect them. And look at what has happened now in a very short space of time. I guess what I want to say is that China has taken a very radical approach. No other country has been doing what China is doing. Initially, I thought this was the most successful containment strategy, and indeed the virus has been contained and suppressed. But I fundamentally don't know which strategy is going to be better in the long run, because as I've said, this makes China much more vulnerable to a second wave of attacks, repeatedly so, whereas other strategies might have the ability to build herd immunity over time and more resistant to this virus or even mutations of the virus. But the trade-off is that there will be a lot of casualties in other places. It's very ironic that a country that has been criticized for human rights violation has actually chosen a strategy where they don't want any casualties and they're willing to take up economic losses, whereas the Western liberal democracies, who have been touting about human rights and freedom and all of these great things, are willing to sacrifice and forsake their people to cut down some of the economic losses. So this virus episode has told us a lot about public health, society, politics, economics, and even the differences in their political systems are reflecting the way that different countries and different people are approaching this great tragic episode. I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Dr. Jin, for that invaluable insights and also your personal experiences. Shall we now move on to Q&A?
Absolutely.
Okay, so if we look at China right now, I think it just reassures that there is life after coronavirus. China, which had started as the epicenter of the virus, is now becoming wary of international travelers arriving into the mainland. Cases outside the Hubei province have been very low, and the eastern province is already up and running. Like you mentioned, 2/3 production is already up. And it now appears business as usual, and it appears pretty normal-ish. For the aftermath in this battle against coronavirus, these changes that you just mentioned, is that mandated by the government or has it become discretionary? And also, China has started testing asymptomatic cases. What does that entail?
So part of it is mandatory, but a lot of it is discretionary. I think that it's not necessarily a rule that you have to wear a mask all the time, although they're changing policies all the time, but this is just what people do. People's social behavior has changed. They go out less. They don't go into crowds. They don't go into shops. That's not at all what the government is asking for. But there's just very few gatherings. But Chinese people, I've realized, is okay to not be so social. But I think that Americans and Europeans are gravely suffering if they're not socializing after a week.
So are Indians. And what about the asymptomatic cases? What does that mean? Should we also be looking at it?
Well, that's another degree of kind of stringency, right? I don't think most countries are at that point yet, given they are still struggling to control and monitor those symptomatic cases. China is very much concerned about asymptomatic cases and imported cases and whether that would lead to another round of infection. So they're taking things extremely seriously, and they're taking these asymptomatic cases also extremely seriously, even though I think that they have infected a total of about 4% of the population, and they're much less potent in their transmission of the virus. But still, it's a major scare for the Chinese government and for the Chinese people.
Got it. Also, countries all around the world are seeing job losses. They are seeing cash transfers, hard cash transfers from the government. They're seeing a cash crunch. They are seeing potential loan waivers in certain countries. How is the Chinese government dealing with these issues to ultimately help the people and then eventually recover the economy?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. So far, the rescue packages and the aid has mostly been in terms of offering credit and liquidity to small business and medium-sized businesses, not so much direct transfers to the people. I think there's one major difference is that Chinese people save. There's a lot of saving. They don't do this hand-to-mouth kind of behavior as we've seen in America and elsewhere. So I have not heard or have not been aware of major problems for the households, even very ordinary people. Now, of course, migrant workers would suffer this time around when they can't go back to their normal jobs. But again, these families also have saving. So I do believe, however, that this is not the optimal policy, because the optimal policy of any government is not just about minimizing economic losses. It's about smoothing out and sharing the costs across its population at any given point in time. And so you want to transfer some resources from those who are less hit, for instance, people who are working in offices, to those who are directly hit, people working in shops and migrant workers. But that's not part of a redistribution policy that we have seen in China, although it should be.
Understood. So this is the next question I have received in various forms and formats. I have tried to condense everything and articles around manufacturing. So China has had established itself as a manufacturing hub. However, post this pandemic, after supply chains and logistics got hit, global companies would want to reduce reliance on, manufacturing solely in one country, which is China, and create manufacturing hubs elsewhere to hedge supply chain risk. Do you see this shift happening?
In terms of manufacturing moving to other countries?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the question? Yeah. We have already seen this before this crisis. We have seen this before the trade war. It's just a general trend. As a country gets kind of more prosperous, wages become higher, and then China is moving up the supply chain, the quality chain, production chain. Jobs get sifted out into other countries with lower wages. That's just a general trend that we have observed. It might have been accelerated by the global trade war. It might be accelerated this time by the pandemic, but it's just part of a trend. And we're definitely seeing some of that. But I think an important point is that it's not just about labor cost. If you think about China with the infrastructure, with the availability of human capital, things work and it's systematic. There's no political risk. That's a very different story when you compare it to other countries that have lower labor costs that might look on the surface more attractive. But what I've heard is that a lot of industries or factories, when they move to countries like Vietnam, they've actually returned to China because it's very hard to get things working. So labor cost is not just really only one factor, but I still believe that it's general trend for some of the lower end manufacturing to gradually move out of China.
And now, as you mentioned, this sort of helps me transition to my next question. So COVID-19 has been part of our headlines in 2020. But before any of this, what was plenty seen in our news everywhere was the US-China trade war. The tensions around this were just about to cool off, with the signing of the deal before this pandemic. Where do you and the Chinese policymakers see China's stance on trade war and trade relations?
It's both an economic and a political question. If it were just about economics, I think both countries would not put tariffs on each other. They wouldn't start a trade war. So it's very much both. Trade war is only a symptom. It's not really a cause of anything fundamental. This is really not about trade. It's about Chinese aspirations. It's about the Chinese development model, and it's about Chinese technology. These are the fundamental drivers of the US-China tension, not the trade aspect. So that will be around, and it will survive even beyond Trump, and it's a bipartisan theme. So I think it's a long-term struggle. In terms of the trade war itself, it's just kind of back and forth bickering with no substantive accomplishments at this point. Yes, Chinese people will have to consume about $2.5 billion of American nuts this year. I guess they'll go nuts over nuts, but maybe it's possible given that everybody's staying at home these days. But that's the kind of things that China promised, and it's really not substantive because America wants something else. America really wants China to change the economic structure of favoring state-owned enterprises and fewer subsidies. China's not going to back off on that. What China wants is momentary, well, at least truce. And China wants to have a good relations with the U.S. China believes that it should serve more the globe, the world, be a more responsible player. So it's willing to change some of its behavior, but it's not willing to change fundamentally its political economy structure, which is having state-owned enterprises not as a majority driver, as a main driver of the economy, but as a backbone, and that's not going to change. So the trade war is really something that President Trump really wanted to see happen, not the Chinese side. But so far, little is accomplished, and even less will be accomplished at this point, given that COVID-19 has reduced demand coming out of China and also reduced substantially supply coming out of the U.S. So this trade deal would have to be put on hold.
Understood. And is the Chinese government helping towards restarting the demand the lost demand, like you mentioned. Has there any been efforts from the government to sort of increase demand of the Chinese public?
Not as much as supply side. So they're really trying to promote business opportunities, supply chain functionings, and logistics and production chains, but less so from the demand side, because demand would inevitably lead to more human interactions that are beyond their control and beyond regulations. So there are no demand side policies for now.
Okay. Now I think we should move a little bit to the business side of things, and we're hosting this webinar on Zoom. And as I think most of our listeners would know, the Zoom stock price has zoomed over the last month. It's up 40%. Last I checked, 45%. We envision this pandemic changing lifestyles of people all around the world. What are the trends that precipitated in post-COVID China, and which ones do you think will stay relevant even after coronavirus tides over?
Well, our equivalent of Zoom was already very popular in China already, so we did not see a similar kind of increase in value for the same technology. On the other hand, I was told that online dating apps became hugely popular over those 2 months. And yes, you can date virtually. Who needs to see each other physically when you can date virtually, right? So that has done really well in China. But this kind of Zoom technologies we already have been very popular, just because China is so much digital and mobile oriented, even before the crisis. I don't really know how long, whether it will fundamentally change the way we work. I think there will be some changes, but I think there's the human interaction, the human touch, the human kind of face-to-face in conferences, or just is still somewhat irreplaceable. But certainly there will be some changes. In China, it's hard to say whether there has been fundamental changes or not. Of course, it has made internet companies even stronger and more powerful than ever before. But that was already a trend that was happening. I think that because China was already so, it permeated Chinese society so much already, the WeChat and the Alibaba, much more than it had penetrated American society. We're more likely to see more rapid changes in the Western economies than I think we will see here.
Speaking of, the trend that came out top in the last few years was ideas based on the concept of a sharing economy. Like co-working and co-living, etc. All your Ubers and Airbnbs and WeWorks and Didi of China. But post-COVID-19, people have embarked on this trend, which is diametrically opposite with work from home and Zoom and things like that. So sharing-based companies have to take a perspective change. I mean, you can not go to an Airbnb. Like you said, you have to go to a conference, but you cannot stay in somebody else's house.
Well, I don't know about Airbnb, but I think we're fundamentally social animals at heart. We've always been, from the beginning. It's in our biological, it's in our genes. We're fundamentally a social animal. So social interactions are still going to continue. I think the models of the sharing economy, where there is real efficiency derived from the model, like ride sharing and all of that, I think will still continue. Of course, that could accelerate some of the need for autonomous vehicles and this and that. But I do think what is fundamentally different is that business over this period are trying to use this, turn the crisis around into opportunity, and they're thinking much more freely, rapidly, creatively about new technologies. So I do think that there will be some permanent augmentations of technology, and less workers, and less, more automation, and even more surveillance in society that will come about. But the social aspect of our interactions, I believe, will not change as much. Maybe it will change some of the way we buy essential goods, we experience services, but you know, as soon as the virus episode and pandemic is over, I think people will really want to get back into that communal life as quickly as ever.
And from a global perspective, globalization has taken a massive hit. What do you think will become of globalization going forward? You know, all countries have closed off their borders, and international travel has been banned from most countries, including India. What does the future look like for the global economy?
There is one camp and a very strong voice saying that this is going to accelerate the deglobalization trend that we had already witnessed before even the arrival of the crisis. First of all, it's important to note that protectionism and the integration comes in waves and cycles throughout history. We've seen protectionist trends before. We've seen a re-embracement of globalization. I believe that, you know, I believe this is a trend, but it's not going to be permanent, and we'll see new ways of integration in the future, even though at the moment the problem really is that in many societies and many countries around the world, the government is not taking care of their people. This is the fundamental reason why there's rising populism and growing protectionism. It's not that it's really globalization that has caused a lot of dislocations and inequalities. It's really that the government have not taken care of the people, and elites have captured a lot of the economic and political power. In China, there's no anti-globalization sentiment, even though the majority of people are not involved with the integrated world, but it's that they've seen their living standards rise all the time, and for the most part, the government is held accountable to people's livelihoods, and they've seen a big improvement. Even though that there's more inequality as well in China, which is inevitable, there's no rising sentiment for anti-globalization and protectionism and populism. So I think that there is a trend, there's a notion that this will accelerate deglobalization, but this is a huge economic cost. I don't think people are realizing that trade and financial integration and flows of people, ideas, and goods have brought enormous economic benefits to the world. They'll probably feel the pain only after this really kicks in for a period of time. With COVID-19, another problem is that how long can you keep the borders closed, right? As long as there's some parts of the world that have not contained the virus, and I do believe developing countries will be the next big victims, and they will not be able to handle the virus as effectively, then all borders will have to be shut. This is the reality of the COVID-19 going forward, and even if you have contained it domestically, you can't open borders if the rest of the world is not on the same in sync. So I think for a period of time, the flow of people will be certainly reduced. The question is there some regulatory international body, international organization that can coordinate amongst countries the flow of trade and the flow of supply, you know, the kind of supply chain trade? If they can guarantee that, then there will be less economic losses. But you really need a lot of coordination. You need a lot of coordination that tells what kind of people can move around, what kind of goods can move around, what kind of logistics. So far, we don't really have that international body yet. So everything will suffer in the economy. I'm more optimistic about the future of globalization. I think that the virus has hit us hard, but that it won't have permanent, painful memories. I might be completely wrong. Because it's more like an asteroid destroying Earth rather than fundamentally changing our psyche in some profound and dark way.
You mentioned it'll be harder going forward for developing countries since they haven't felt the hit yet. Can you elaborate a little more on that? I ask for all our listeners and who are part of the developing country.
Well, I think that the virus will hit developing countries. It's an equal opportunity menace, right? For one reason or another, developing countries might in general be a little bit behind the curve, but they have even less kind of tools and government power to kind of to stem it. I mean, of course, I think India has done a great job in terms of that awareness of the potential damage of the virus, and has put in place very strict measures. But that's not going to be all of the developing countries. And if the virus does get spread in these developing countries, many of them are tourists. Tourists will bring them in. Then the density of the people, the health facilities, let alone government fiscal monetary policies to support people and support a complete halt of the economy. You need a lot of fiscal capacity for that. And how many developing countries have these resources? Not to say about the dearth of supplies and equipments, and other kind of health facilities will bring about a lot of casualties. So I'm seriously worried about developing countries, and they're often left they're left out in some ways, even as we've seen with the Great Recession of 2008. Developing countries also took a big hit, but if you look at what the U.S. Central Bank is doing, the U.S. Fed is arranging liquidity central bank swap lines amongst advanced economies, not with developing countries. Actually, China came in to help, and China guaranteed liquidity for developing countries in problems and financial crises. So China recognizes that there is that big gap to be filled, and it's willing to take a lot of leadership in trying to help fill that gap, because it's also belonging to the emerging market category. But I think that when this hits the developing countries, it would be more difficult to put in measures and help contain and also ease the suffering of its people.
Absolutely true, because in India, we went in lockdown when our cases were in few hundreds, as opposed to parts of the US going in lockdown, or actually not yet lockdown anyway, when the cases are in thousands. So Asian countries have, I would say, more or less averted this crisis associated to the pandemic. China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and even Taiwan, from whatever they learned during the SARS outbreak of 2003. So, economic impact in these Asian countries, I think, will be somewhat minimized upon comparison to the Western countries. So, do you think that Asian countries, I mean, there's going to be some kind of a change in the power equation, and since we have demonstrated, and other Asian countries have demonstrated such remarkable resilience, how do you think us as Asia can leverage this? I mean, is this a sunrise time for us?
I think that it is a time for big countries like China and India to play a greater role and to build trust in the international community. It's been very difficult to do that, at least for China, and somewhat for India as well, as rising powers, to build that trust and build this international image in the world. If the interest is not just strategic and geopolitical, but it is coming out of a moral imperative to help other countries, to not be bystanders, but really actively share the experience, the data, the aid, the supplies, out of a moral imperative, that would be a really great opportunity to take advantage of, given that kind of nationalist and geopolitical competition and realpolitik is practiced so much these days. It will be very important, and it's the people around the world that will see these actions, not words, but actions. So I do think that this is a very big opportunity, but more for the big emerging markets rather than for the small ones who are going to be on the end of needing more help than being able to offer help.
Okay, I think I agree with that moral imperative. I think I'm being signaled that we are short on time now. So Dr. Jin, one final question that we ask all of our FutureBets speakers till now. It's a very open-ended question. You can take however you see fit. I want to ask you, what is your future bet? Going forward in the future, what is Dr. Jin betting on?
I'm betting on, at the moment, a lot more anti-fragility measures being put in place around the world to not take our lives for granted and to really prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Jin. We are very grateful that you gave us time in sensitive times for you right now. Personally, well, congratulations. Dr. Jin is expecting a baby and she agreed to talk to us in a third trimester. Thank you, Dr. Jin. If we, there will be a recording available of this webinar. And please keep track with us. We are going to host a lot more such brightest minds of the world in these FutureBets web series. Reach out to whoever you know at Ashika, whoever has sent you this invitation to follow up. Dr. Jin, I would request you that if we have any other, follow-up question, I will send that your way, and if you would be so kind to address it.
Absolutely, it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Jin, and thank you, everybody. Have a
I wish India the best of luck in dealing with this.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. Thank you so much.